Welcome to Deerhound Productions, the channel for videos about all your favorite horror games. I'm DanCat33, and today we'll be diving into Tales from the Pizzaplex, the Five Nights at Freddy's book series. As the name suggests, Tales mostly focuses on the Pizzaplex from Security Breach, Ruin, and Help Wanted 2. Unlike the previous book series, Tales sets up the future of Five Nights at Freddy's, most notably with its introduction of the Mimic, the main villain in the newest installments. In this video, we'll be recapping every Tales story important to understanding the games. So stories with less significance, like Lally's game, won't be covered in this video. Sorry again, Lally fans. Also, these stories will be covered in chronological order, which may get a little messy down the line, since it's hard to tell which story takes place when, but we'll do our best. Without further ado, let's start off with the Mimic's origin story, simply titled The Mimic. This story focuses on Edwin Murray, a robotics engineer whose inventive nature began at a young age. At around 4 years old, Edwin had begun taking apart his mother's small appliances to see how they worked, even though they usually didn't work when he put them back together. I guess it was difficult to put the pieces together. Luckily, his mother tolerated frequently replacing things Edwin broke. By the time he was 8, he knew he wanted to make inventions that would improve people's lives, doing the most mundane tasks and chores people didn't enjoy. In college, he got his first patent on a robotic vacuum cleaner. It was expensive and buggy, but sold well enough, allowing Edwin to begin his business right out of school in the early 70s. This vacuum has a minor cameo in the racing game 5 Laps at Freddy's, where it appears on a billboard on the Midnight Motorist track, and its design shares some similarities to Mr. Hugs. The vacuum funded a good life for Edwin and his wife, Fiona, who met at school and married as soon as they graduated. Eventually, the vacuum sales fell off since they didn't last as long as customers expected. Edwin and Fiona were still able to purchase an abandoned factory in the industrial part of town on the edge of a 4-way highway. This is where Edwin would house his business. And they also purchased the old Queen Anne mansion, which they planned on restoring to its former glory. These plans were derailed when Fiona died during childbirth, leaving Edwin with his noisy baby, David. He spent the following weeks trying to function on an hour or two of sleep. Instead of fixing his vacuums or making a new invention, Edwin had to take care of David. He loved his son, but without Fiona, he couldn't handle everything. Around 2.5 years later, Edwin's finances ran dry, leaving him with no choice but to sell his company out to Fazbear Enterprises. Grant Starling, the Fazbear Entertainment executive responsible for negotiating the buyout, told him he was doing the right thing, even though Edwin didn't think so. He became trapped in a life he didn't want to live, turning the costumes Fazbear Entertainment sent him into robots, which he didn't think were useful. Now it's important to note this story takes place sometime in the 70s, likely before 1979, since it seems like that's when the upcoming game Secret of the Mimic happens, which occurs after this story. More on that later. Edwin didn't have time to take care of David and make all of Fazbear's animatronics. For example, David accidentally knocks over and damages a metal chicken head. Edwin decides he needs a nap. He notes how remarkably big he is for his age, and how the 5'5" Edwin won't be able to carry him around forever. He takes David to his bedroom in the building. After Fiona's death, he only kept the factory and converted its offices into a small apartment with a compact sitting area, a tiny kitchen, 1 bathroom, and 1 bedroom. The interior brick and white walls were decorated with David's art and old photographs Edwin found in the factory. David and Edwin shared a bedroom so he could keep an eye on him, but most of the time, he worked on the factory's main floor and David slept in a cot nearby. As Edwin takes him to the bedroom, he looks at the wooden tiger head above David's bed, carved to mimic his favorite toy, a plush tiger, appropriately named Tiger. This gets Edwin thinking of mimicking, and he gets an idea for a new project that could keep David entertained and free up time for him. It puts him 3 weeks behind Fazbear Entertainment's projects and makes him lose a lot of sleep, but he pours his heart and soul into his next creation. He couldn't afford supplies, so he used a lot of machinery and parts from the factory to create a primitive, legless endoskeleton. He stole hardware from some of his abandoned projects to create a computer for it, and programmed a thinking mind that would learn from mimicking what it observed. Edwin wrote the program at the speed of light, taking several shortcuts, but he was happy with the result. After 22 days of working on his son's new friend, it was finally done. Edwin showed off the endo to David, and he realized it might look frightening. Instead, David appears more curious, and asks his dad the creation's name. Edwin named the program Mimic 1, so he decided to call the endoskeleton the Mimic. It's worth noting that along with the lack of legs, this version of the character has novelty chattering teeth and pincher-like hands. Edwin reaches behind the Mimic's neck and presses its activation switch. Its eyes light up and its mouth opens and closes. David is startled. He hugs his tiger plushie to his chest, and the Mimic copies David by hugging a tiger-sized invisible object. He's delighted by the Mimic copying him and refers to the Mimic as a he. Thanks to that, the Mimic is gendered as a male throughout the story. Edwin picks him up and takes him and David upstairs. The Mimic wraps its pinchers around Edwin's wrists. A primitive part of his brain fears the Mimic will clamp down and hurt him, but instead, his touch is gentle, even hesitant. Unlike the violent and murderous behavior I'm sure most of you are familiar with, initially, the Mimic is very kind and caring. After activating the Mimic, Edwin catches up on some sleep, and for the next 2 weeks, he works on Phasma Entertainment's characters with long, uninterrupted work time. While Edwin hadn't given the Mimic a voice box, its muteness didn't seem to bother David. He developed a sort of sign language to communicate with him. This featured imitations of things he was trying to communicate, like eating ice cream. What the Mimic can do is somewhat limited, only being able to slowly copy David's movements. Over time, Edwin tinkered with the endoskeleton, allowing him to move smoother. He notes how quickly the Mimic is learning and starts brainstorming ideas for how he could apply the Mimic 1 program to many tasks. When Edwin completes the animatronic chicken he was working on, he finds David and the Mimic coloring together on the floor. The Mimic's drawing is messy, but to be fair, David's isn't much better. Later that day, Edwin sees the Mimic and David tossing a red rubber ball back and forth. Similar to drawing, neither of them are very good at it. But David was delighted by their clumsy games of catch. The Mimic went everywhere David did and copied his motions. One evening while eating, David pushed his bowl of mac and cheese in front of the Mimic, so it immediately grabbed a spoon and scooped up some noodles. Edwin, the heartless monster he is, stops the Mimic from eating the mac and cheese, and I'm surprised this isn't why the Mimic turned evil. David laughs so hard at this that the milk he's drinking comes out through his nose. The Mimic copies the movement of David laughing, which only makes him laugh harder. He wants to go play trains, but Edwin tells David to put the milk in the refrigerator first, and the Mimic witnesses this. Edwin notes how because of the way David hugs his tiger plush to his chest, the Mimic curves one of his arms in a way that suggests an invisible tiger being held. This poses reference throughout the series. In Security Breach, Burntrap, who is implied to be the Mimic, curls his arm to his chest. Then in Ruin, when the Mimic appears, it briefly curls its arm, and the YouTube's figure has this pose too. Later, Edwin finishes programming a pirate fox, and now's a good time to mention that he never calls any of the Freddy's characters by their actual names, likely because he hates his job and doesn't care about making the animatronic characters. After completing the fox's programming, he finds David and the Mimic folding some of the factory's lace. David asks the Mimic if he's ready, and he nods. Edwin notices how he's now responding rather than just mimicking, showing how he's evolving. The endoskeleton then smiles and reveals a lace white tiger plush curled in his left arm. David beams, and the Mimic's eyes light up brighter than usual. Some people believe the Mimic has already gained sentience thanks to David's positive emotions. This is hinted at by the Mimic responding instead of mimicking like it was programmed to do, and its eyes glowing brighter as a response to David. While the Mimic is a good friend, it unfortunately can't answer all the questions David has. While asking questions and brushing his teeth, David accidentally flings toothpaste all over his clean shirt. Edwin has to take their clothes to a laundromat, which he hates, so he gets mad at David for dirtying his shirt. He yells at him, and David begins to cry. Edwin unwisely shakes his son and yells at him, then immediately regrets what he's done. David reaches for the Mimic, who wraps his hands around his fingers to comfort him. Edwin calms down and promises to do better for his son. Shortly after, he finds David's zebra pajamas crumbled on the floor, and makes David hang them back up in the closet, all while the Mimic watches. A couple of hours later, Edwin is interrupted by David and the Mimic frolicking around in Phasma Entertainment costumes. David is running on all fours while wearing a yellow dog costume, while the Mimic is stuffed inside the top part of a green alligator costume. This alligator is very interesting. It also appeared in the demo for Secret of the Mimic, and it might be an early version of Montgomery Gator. David and the Mimic get the costumes filthy, and Edwin removes them from the suits. Half an hour later, David interrupts him while he's soldering, making him mess up. Edwin refrains from yelling at David again, and instead tells him to quietly play with the Mimic. A few days before, Edwin had found a variety of colored construction paper in the factory, and gave it to them to draw on. The two make all sorts of odd drawings, surrounded by markings that look vaguely like hieroglyphics. That night, Edwin continues improving the Mimic, updating its programming so it can use its arms and torso more fluidly and scoot across the ground. He also updated the Mimic's processors, allowing him to execute more complex tasks. After upgrading the Mimic, he returns to Phasma Entertainment's animatronic projects, working up until just before dawn. Afterwards, he goes up to their living quarters and falls into a restless sleep. 2 hours later, David wakes him up, wanting to play catch outside. Edwin is only half able to process hearing David say he'll be waiting outside for his dad. He goes downstairs to the factory's first floor. Edwin thinks the Mimic will keep David occupied as he takes a shower and makes breakfast. Afterward, he goes downstairs and calls out for David, with no response. He feels a chill go down his spine and is suddenly on alert. He calls his son's name again, with the slightest edge of fear, which escalates when he sees the factory's doors wide open. He runs out of the factory, and the next 10 seconds of his life are compacted into an infinite experience of horror that happened instantaneously but also continued forever. Edwin witnesses the red ball bounce onto the nearest lane of traffic. David runs after it, oblivious to the oncoming white van. Edwin is no longer able to process what he's seeing, and as he flies towards his son, he's aware he's running towards something he'd never reach and away from something he could never escape. He tries to gather his son's broken body into his arms, but he's pulled back by people telling him not to move the body. Edwin screams as the sounds fade into a distant roar, and all of the colors blur together. For the next 2 weeks following David's death, Edwin disappears into a fugue. He has no memory of anything besides the endless loop of David's death that replays in his mind over and over again. He has some understanding that he lived through burying his son. Now he's alone and life is just supposed to go on. He tries to go through his normal morning routine, despite knowing that nothing will ever be normal again. Downstairs at his work table, Edwin encounters the Mimic and thinks about deactivating him, but doesn't have the energy to do it. He tries to continue constructing a Blue Bunny character for Fazbear Entertainment, but he's interrupted by the Mimic climbing onto the table. Edwin remembers after David's death, the Mimic had begun to carry around the tiger plush. He snatched the tiger from the Mimic and cried into it. In the present, the Mimic sets aside his own tiger plush and does David's sign language for wanting ice cream. Seeing this is too much for Edwin to process. He screams and has the sudden, out-of-control urge to destroy something. He quickly grabs a metal bar and unleashes a fury of attacks upon the Mimic, pulverizing the only real thing he could attack to annihilate his pain. His despair turned to rage that he had to get out, even though he knew the real target of his anger was himself. He wanted to destroy himself, but he couldn't, so he unleashes wrath upon the Mimic. He could almost feel his murderous thoughts fusing with its programming. Finally, his anger ran out and he collapsed, looking at what he had done. One of the Mimic's eyes was now dangling against its bashed jaw. Its spine was bent backward and its ribcage was crushed in multiple places. The Mimic, now resembling total defeat, lay toppled over, his arms bent in one last tragic copy of David. Edwin's anger quickly dissolved into regret, and the regret brought tears that he thought might just flow forever. After Edwin's attack on the Mimic, he disappeared, and since he breached his contract, Fazbear Entertainment gained ownership of his property. Months later, a Fazbear Entertainment team composed of Dominic, Glenn, and Harry are sent to clean up the mess and make repairs to the factory. The building is out of power thanks to a paperwork mix-up with the power company, so you know this is going to take a dive into horror. As they enter the factory, Dominic notices a metal rack with some hanging costumes, such as Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and a couple of bright pink and yellow-green court jester costumes. The jester can be seen on a cutout in Secret of the Mimic's gameplay trailer. Unlike Edwin, Dominic actually knows the name of all these characters. He also spots David's cot with a visible indent, as if something heavy had laid there frequently. In the cot is the Mimic's lace tiger plush. To make this story even more sad, it looks like the Mimic has been sleeping in David's old cot. The Fazbear team has no clue what they're supposed to do, so they start exploring the building. Dominic finds the kitchen, which is filled with an awful smell and a stain under the refrigerator. He wisely chooses to ignore that and finds a Fazbear Entertainment satchel in Edwin and David's room. He figures that another team must have been sent to the factory, and he finds a tape recording from a previous team that confirms his suspicions. In the recording, a man complains about being sent to the factory the week before Christmas and being trapped inside. He mentions the boards covering up the factory's windows and the main door locking behind them. He then talks about a generator in the building, which Dominic's team members quickly power up, and the recording man says they're working on finishing Edwin's projects. Dominic stops the recording briefly to search around more, and smells something decaying coming from a closet. He again ignores the red flags and listens to the tape some more. The man on the recording says they patched up the roof and rerouted some of the building's power. They then assessed the endoskeletons and made some adjustments. The man mentions that after a break, they're going to complete a cool endoskeleton which is lacking legs. They plan on taking some legs off a non-functioning endoskeleton and adding them to the more advanced one. If you didn't pick up on what's going on, the previous team found the Mimic and gave it legs. Dominic regroups with Harry and Glenn, and Harry swears he saw something moving on the 3rd floor. Dominic relays what he learned in the tape, and they discover that just like the previous team, they've been locked in the factory. Things only get worse when they realize one of the court jester costumes is missing. The group decides they should figure out what exactly the bad smell upstairs was. They open the blood-leaking refrigerator and find quite the horrific sight. Inside is a man who'd been broken down and compressed into the refrigerator so violently that he had nearly been decapitated, and his limbs had been snapped so his entire body could fit inside. This kill is a result of the Mimic copying David putting things in the refrigerator. The team then finds a body hanging among the clothing in the closet. A metal rod had been speared through his chest, and the rod was wired to a wooden suit hanger. This is again the Mimic copying David. The Mimic has twisted these ordinary tasks into violent murder methods. If you're confused why the Mimic is suddenly killing people, it's likely because when Edwin attacked it, his murderous thoughts and agony were fused into its programming, resulting in its violent behavior. Shortly after finding the body in the closet, Dominic and Glenn hear Harry screaming. They see the Mimic, wearing the missing court jester costume, scooping Harry's brain out of his skull, likely mimicking David's sign language, which included scooping ice cream. After killing Harry, the Mimic then turns to Dominic and Glenn and they run. They hide under the lace on the factory's first floor. Dominic falls asleep, but Glenn wakes him up, saying the jester is gone. Dominic notices the bloody court jester costume lying under Edwin's work table, and a hanging mushroom costume by Glenn starts to move. Dominic yells for him to look out, and even though Glenn immediately runs, it's too late. The Mimic, now wearing the Mushroom Man costume, has faster reflexes and it grabs the back of Glenn's collar. It quickly lifts him off the ground and rams him headfirst into the factory's brick wall, pulverizing his head like a smashed melon. The crushed head was driven into Glenn's neck, and then once again he was slammed into the wall. From the ribcage up, Glenn is left as shredded tissue and mangled bone. Similar to the Jester, the Mushroom Man costume appears in the Secret of the Mimic gameplay trailer, albeit it's a blue version. There's a red version seen in the security office, which likely is meant to be a mini version of the one from this story. Dominic runs to the top floor of the factory. He logically decides that the best way to kill the murder robot is to build another murder robot. He goes down to the second floor to grab the other team's tools. He finds that Harry's body is gone and in its place is the Mushroom Man costume. He quickly grabs the satchel and runs back to the third floor. But it's too late. From a pile of machinery rises the Mimic, now wearing a grayish-purple lion costume. Dominic quickly turns to run back downstairs, but the Mimic is faster, grabbing him by the ankle and yanking him back up the stairs. It then reaches up through Dominic's chest and rips his throat out back through his body. Dominic's heart races and explodes inside his chest, and the story ends with him giving into the darkness consuming him. Secret of the Mimic seems to follow Team B's demise, and our main character is sent to the factory to retrieve the Mimic for Fazbear Entertainment. We'll see how their mission goes when Secret of the Mimic releases on June 13th. While the Mimic's origin story was setting up the future, our next story, Dittophobia, shed some light on the past. This is the final story in Tales, so it's fitting that it solves one of the biggest lore debates, that being just what is going on in Five Nights at Freddy's 4. In that so-called final chapter, you play as a child in a bedroom fending off nightmarish versions of the Freddys and Fredbear animatronics. Details such as an IV stand, pills, and flowers hinted that this was all a hospital dream or coma. Later entries implied illusion technology creates our animatronic adversaries, and the whole thing is connected to some sort of underground experiment at Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rentals, which was the main location in the 5th game, Sister Location, and where William Afton's Funtime animatronics were stored. While these later entries tried to explain Five Nights at Freddy's 4, it got very muddled, so luckily Scott Cawthon just wrote a whole story explaining it. It follows Rory, a young boy who is tormented by night terrors, in which monsters enter his room to scare him. These monsters are the nightmare animatronics from Five Nights at Freddy's 4. And his bedroom is described just like the bedroom from that game. After this night terror, Rory wakes up in his room, which is unusually silent, except for a hissing sound from the vents, which he finds soothing. He calls out for his parents with no response, and he assumes they're getting ready for work. He decides to get prepped for school, showing us some previously unseen areas in the house, such as a light blue bathroom with tiled floor, and a big bathtub with feet that look like creatures' claws. After getting changed, he hears his mom taking a shower, but once again receives no response from her. He gives up getting his parents' attention and goes to their great room, which is an open part of the house where the living room, dining room, and kitchen are all together. When Rory opens the refrigerator, he smells something stale, but ignores it and grabs a bagel and a pear from the produce drawer. He notices the pear is brown and seems softer than it should have been. The bagel is also old and dry. He finishes his nasty breakfast, grabs his backpack, and goes to leave for school, but suddenly realizes there's no front door. He also notices the window's thick shade, making it impossible to see outside. As he searches for the front door, he starts to feel drowsier. Rory keeps going through the house, feeling more and more disoriented, until he notices it's dark outside. He strangely enough puts his backpack back where he found it and heads to bed. Once again, he's attacked by the nightmare animatronics before waking back up. Rory then repeats his daily routine: absent parents, spoiled food, missing front door, and nightmare robots, all your normal stuff. The next morning, he finds his food is more spoiled than normal, and yet again, he can't find the front door. This time as he's searching his house, he hears a knocking from inside the walls that sounds like an engine failing. The sound abruptly stops, and so does the hissing vents and the shower, but the refrigerator is left running. Rory brushes that off and goes to bed. This night, Rory doesn't have any nightmares, and not only that, but his room is now dirty, with the wallpaper peeling and the carpet being filthy. One of the closet doors is sagging and the other is bent, and all of the room's doors are covered in dust. The bed's blankets are also dirty and falling apart. Reading about the Five Nights at Freddy's 4 bedroom all rotting is pretty interesting. Rory notices that he's changed too. He's older with longer hair, a face covered with acne, and an almost skeletal body. Instead of the 7-year-old boy he looked like the day before, Rory says he looks more like a 17-year-old teenager. He goes to the great room, which is now as grimy as the rest of the house, and the kitchen is infested with ants. When he opens the refrigerator, it's not what he remembers. It's more like a dispenser, with rows of fun-sized tan wafers wrapped in faded yellow packaging. They don't taste like much and disintegrate in his mouth. He tries to find his parents, but it turns out their door is fake. It has no hinges or gaps around the edges. Similarly, his parents' bathroom is just a fake door with a speaker above it, playing the sounds of a shower running. Rory notices metal tracks on the floor that lead to his room. He follows one set that disappears under a door. Rory yanks it open and discovers a decrepit purple-blue bunny costume with deadly-looking teeth and claws. This is Nightmare Bonnie, one of the animatronics tormenting Rory during his night terrors. However, it turns out he's nothing more than a costume hung on a flimsy metal skeleton that's transported to Rory's room on rails throughout the house. Rory explores further, finding Nightmare Foxy in the closet, Nightmare Freddy in a trapdoor under his bed, and Nightmare Chica in a closet. Rory continues to search the house, finding even more fake doors, but nothing else. He figures the refrigerator's wafers must refill from somewhere, and after gutting the dispenser, he finds a tunnel. He wisely grabs a flashlight before he ventures further, and ends up in a concrete hallway lined with gas canisters. These are connected to hoses, and the gas is pumped into the house. There's a machine that currently isn't running, and past that, Rory finds a clipboard on a desk. Attached to it is a paper with a handwritten entry. The date on it is just a month after Rory's 7th birthday. Rory reads the entry. Subject continues to react with fear to what he perceives to be creatures. Fear level 9. He flips through more similar entries. According to the papers, the gas in the tanks were hallucinogens that were pumped into Rory's house through the vents, hence why they were hissing. The gas made him think his life was normal, and it also caused Rory's night terrors. The whole thing was an experiment to study the effects of ongoing fear in children. Whoever was behind the experiment wanted to see what would happen if a child experienced the same terrors every night, without a proper day life to balance out the nightmares. The machine pumping the gas had broken down, allowing Rory to see through the illusion. The most disturbing realization is the experiment's been abandoned for 10 years. The gas and wafers had been automated. No one was there making sure everything worked right. Rory suddenly fears the gas could turn back on, so he unscrews the hose, then sets out to escape. He goes deeper in, finding himself in a dirtier corridor covered in pipes. Eventually, he ends up in an observation station. The room has a window looking into a dark room. Above it are 4 lights, colored blue, green, pink, and yellow. On one of the windows is a poster of a wild-looking girl with red pigtails. This is identical to the circus control room from Five Nights at Freddy's sister location, confirming the fear experiments are connected to Circus Baby's entertainment and rentals. Rory goes further into the facility, ending up in Ballora Gallery, where he encounters Ballora herself, who luckily doesn't seem to be active. He goes forward through the gallery, ending up in the breaker room. He messes with the breaker box, but pressing the switches doesn't do anything. Likely because, as shown in the games, they need to be held down. Rory continues through the facility, going down hallways we never see in the games, and he enters a room with animatronic parts stacked on the shelves. This is likely meant to be parts in service, just, if Scott Cawthon had actually modeled the room. He then enters a big room with a stage and tables. This is Funtime Auditorium, and Rory quickly spots the shelved animatronic Pirate Fox, likely some sort of variant of Funtime Foxy. He then stumbles upon the control module, and makes some interesting observations. He notes clown masks hanging above the room's fan, likely referring to Ennard's mask. It seems like this story takes place prior to Sister Location's ending, where the animatronics fuse into Ennard. The main piece of evidence is that Ballora is still around, and the mask hanging on the control module wall also implies Ennard hasn't been made yet. Ignoring the spaghetti robot, Rory finds blueprints in a drawer, labeled Underground Testing Facility. He studies them, and discovers a hallway connected to the control module leading into an elevator. Rory enters it, and it's decorated with posters of Baby and Ballora, just like it is in-game. He presses a red button, which is similarly from the game, but nothing happens. Rory figures there's no power, hence why there's been no light in the facility. He returns to the control module and finds a radio, then changes the frequency to contact his friend, Wade. Rory had been worried Wade was just another fabricated memory, but he's real and fills Rory in on everything he's missed. The police gave up searching for him after a year, but his parents never did. They hired all sorts of private detectives and even set up a website to help find him. More importantly, we learn that Rory has a 9-year-old sister now. Rory recaps everything he's learned to Wade, and he figures if the facility is out of power but the house isn't, there must be a separate generator keeping the house going. Wade plans on calling the police as Rory goes to find the generator, and the two say their awkward goodbyes. Let's just hope no Eggmen were listening in on that call. When he returns to the fake house, it's night, and he wants to hurry before the nightmare animatronics emerge. Unfortunately, he has to check the closets for the generator, and that's when Chica activates. Without the gas running, he sees the very fake nightmare Chica, who rolls on the tracks until she disappears into Rory's room. He searches both Chica and Bonnie's closets, but he still doesn't find the generator. He opens the kitchen cabinets and sees gray rubber behind it. He finally realizes the refrigerator hasn't been making noise, it's been the generator all along. He rips away the rubber, which he figures out is soundproofing, and reveals the generator. Rory starts to tug at it when a voice says hello. It then asks him not to disrupt the generator, and he spots a speaker blended into the ceiling. Rory asks who the voice is, but they don't answer, instead saying the generator is taking care of him by keeping everything running. Rory describes the voice as a man, and one who's very calm and soothing. While Rory doesn't know who the man is, I'm sure almost everyone here knows it's Willie Mafton, the main villain in the original installments and the owner of Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rentals. Afton says Rory wants to be here, and reminds him of how he ran away from home. He tells him how he never fit in at school, how he wasn't good at math or reading, and how the girls thought he was wimpy. Afton tells Rory he's taken care of here, he's never an outcast or wrong. He's watched over and cared for him, unlike his parents. Rory reflects on how his parents were never home, and when his mom was, all she did was tell him how wrong he was. Afton says this is his home. All these years he's been watched over and cared for because he's special. Rory succumbs to Afton's pressure, thinking about how wrong he'd always felt outside the facility, and he's now a decade behind the rest of the world. He resecures the generator and returns to the gas machine. He realizes the reason it broke was because the power cord had come loose, setting off this whole chain of events. He plugs it back in and the gas resumes flowing. Rory climbs back through the refrigerator and into the house, and suddenly feels drowsy. He's then back to thinking he has a 7-year-old boy at home. He's confused why it's so late and goes back to his room and falls asleep in bed. The story ends with one last disturbing revelation. In a metal grate above the gas pump, a recorder rewinds, ready for the next time Rory wanders too far. Willie Mafton's monologue was just a recording, one last precaution to prevent Rory from escaping. This story has a lot of implications for the games. It confirms the theory that Five Nights at Freddy's 4 was an experiment conducted by Willie Mafton, and connected to the underground Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rentals facility. However, there are still some loose ends from this story. Some people think that Wade wasn't real, and was just another part of the experiment making sure Rory didn't escape. After all, he did send Rory back to the house to steal the generator, which sets off Afton's gaslighting recording. I'm not sure how much I believe this though. It's also never explained why Afton stopped monitoring the experiments. Some possibilities are because he was spring-locked, or he's simply lost interest. Another lingering question is why he even made these experiments. It's possible he was trying to replicate the fear his son was experiencing. As in Five Nights at Freddy's 4's minigames, we see his son, the crying child, constantly terrified. Maybe he was trying to replicate his son's fear in other children, or maybe the experiments caused his son's constant fear, who knows. There's way too much to discuss, and I don't want to drag this story on any longer. One thing I believe is more certain is Rory's fate. While the story ends on an ambiguous note, implying he's doomed to repeat this cycle all over again, there are some details implying he dies. The wafers Rory's been eating for a decade are said to be freeze-dried sources of all the nutrients a human body needs. However, Rory's skinny size implies this might not be enough for him anymore. It's reasonable to assume that eventually he died from malnourishment, and this might connect to a detail in Sister Location. In Night 2, Hand Unit mentions they found a dead body in the vent leading to the elevator. This, paired with the implication that Rory will try to leave again, makes me think he escaped after the events of the story, but died before he could leave the facility. Regardless, I believe Rory's fate is sealed. A tragic end for a character who's gone through so much. Jumping into the future, the next story, Help Wanted, takes place following the 6th game, Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator. After years of tragedies and rumors surrounding Fazbear Entertainment, the company desperately needs to reinvent its image. And their savior is Steve Snodgrass, a struggling indie game developer working on family-friendly games. Steve is very clearly based on Scott Cawthon, the creator of Five Nights at Freddy's, who also started off as a struggling indie game developer making family-friendly games. Steve unfortunately works a dead-end job at a gas station, but he's approached by Brock Edwards, a man who works at Fazbear Entertainment. Steve recalls how Fazbear Entertainment's places had been popular, but fell off due to stories about murders and paranormal events. This is referring to the original Five Nights at Freddy's series, where Willie Mafton murdered children at Freddy's and their souls went on to haunt the animatronics. Just to be clear, the newer games exist in the same universe as the original games, but there's sort of a new era for the franchise, so most people separate them as the Scott era, consisting of Five Nights at Freddy's through Ultimate Custom Night and Frights, and the Steel era, which includes Help Wanted through Secret of the Mimic and these Tales books. Scott Cawthon still works on the story of the series, but the games themselves are developed by Steelwool. Just wanted to clear that up in case anyone was confused. Brock Edwards says people only know Phasma Entertainment for the rumors surrounding their brand. So to laugh them off, they want to put out a line of video games based on what people say happened in the pizzerias. Steve finds the idea distasteful. After all, these are games being made based on actual murders committed at Freddy's. Brock says they'd like him to develop 4 games. And while this is a fantastic offer, Steve is understandably uncomfortable. He rejects the opportunity and goes back to mopping the floor. The next morning, he gets a message on his dating app. He expected it to be from his girlfriend Amanda, but instead sees a message from someone named Victoria. He says she's his ideal woman and decides to ditch his current girlfriend for Victoria. She wants to meet at her house far out in the country. Steve stupidly ignores the glaring red flags and goes to see her. While the scenery out in the country is beautiful, Victoria's house could use some work. The inside of the white cottage has no decorations or furniture. There's a soft but steady mechanical sound in the house, and suddenly an intense ringing fills the air. Steve props himself on the wall, but the sound is soon replaced by Victoria's voice. Before they can say much, the ringing returns. Steve hears it coming from a smoke alarm, a bit odd since he can't see any smoke. The room intensely spins, and Steve wakes up lying on a couch in a now much more decorated house. He's confused, but Victoria explains he had a bad car crash a few years back, and now suffers from memory loss. Then we get another big memory gap, and now he has kids. Steve thinks about all the memories he's missed, and in a kind of funny moment, he briefly wonders if the kids are even his. Their names are Abigail and Avery, by the way, but I doubt I'll call them by their names. Steve enjoys a nice morning with his family and pancakes, which are superior to waffles, by the way. Unfortunately, the nice morning is ruined by notice of foreclosure. Turns out Steve still works at the gas station, so his family is pretty screwed financially. Luckily, later that night, their savior appears, Brock Edwards, once again proposing Phasma Entertainment's offer to Steve. Now with his house on the line, he accepts and begins developing Phasma Entertainment's games. That night, he hears a banging sound and finds Abigail repeatedly running into a coffee table. Oh hey, I did use the kids' names. He takes her back to bed, but is unable to close her bedroom door. For some reason, none of them fully close or lock. He channels his nighttime visions and fears into the game's horror. At night, he hears the mechanical whirring in the walls, and he sees a large pulsating bubble that pops like a zit, and a black substance spills across the room. He tries to wake Victoria, but she tells him it's just a nightmare and puts him back to sleep. The following morning, the man on the radio, DJ Dan the Music Man, reports on heavy snow coming in, trapping Steve and his family in the house. He believes the monsters in the wall made the snow to keep him inside with them. Starting to get a little Jack Torrance crazy there, Steve. The ringing sound is increasing too, always buzzing in his head. Despite all this, Steve has completed the first Phasma Entertainment game. After beginning development on the second game, he goes to take a shower, and notices cuts all over his body, confirming his night terrors are real and something's actively hurting him. He understandably can't sleep, so he sits on the living room couch watching TV. I wonder if they get Immortal and the Restless on there. Instead of being interrupted by Ennard, he hears a banging from the kitchen. But don't worry, Steve, it's just her son Avery standing by the sink. Once he puts his son to bed, the walls around him begin to pulsate, and a giant head emerges from the wall. It's small, has large eyes with cat-like pupils, and a mouth full of sharp teeth. Its tongue shoots out, piercing Steve's skin, and then a bunch of snakes pop out of the walls. He runs to his bedroom and tells his wife what's going on, but she says he's just under a lot of pressure. He reluctantly goes to sleep, still hearing the high-pitched ringing. The next morning, DJ Dan the Music Man is playing on the radio again, and randomly confirms that Taylor Swift doesn't exist in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe. Instead, there's Sailor Thrift, which might be an upgrade. Steve is now working on the third Phasma Entertainment game, and at dinner, he's getting sick of DJ Dan the Music Man, since the guy's on the radio all day and night. When he changes the station, there's only static. Apparently they're not able to get any other signals in the country. Steve also remembers how there's no cell service and begins to feel trapped. Soon after Victoria goes to bed, Steve hears scraping behind the walls, and in another bizarre encounter, a spider the size of a basketball drops in through the ceiling. And then thousands of spiders emerge from it. Ew! They start crawling over Steve in a nasty scene, but when Victoria goes to help him, they're gone, and the ringing in his head gets more intense. He thinks it sounds like a smoke detector, so he grabs the fireplace poker and violently destroys the one in their house. While the ringing is gone, another sound fills Steve's ears. Mechanical sounds. He sees there's now tread marks on the floor and trapdoors in the walls and ceilings where monsters had jumped out at him. Sounds a little like Dittophobia. Steve hears a mechanical creature coming toward him, so he quickly hides. He hears his wife calling for him, but instead of seeing her, all he sees is a steel robot with visible wires and circuits. The only part of it resembling a human is a mask with feminine features. After some initial confusion, Steve realizes Victoria has been a robot all along, and it turns out the kids are robots too. So circling back to the question of the children's parenthood, no Steve, they're not your kids. The robots begin aggressively searching the house. To make things worse, DJ Dan starts directly talking to Steve, telling him his family's worried and he needs to come out. He starts going to his bedroom, but hides in the bathroom shower when Victoria gets near. She tears the shower curtain away, but Steve manages to overpower her, pushing his robot wife away and running into his room. All three of his robo family members pursue him, and he has to hold the bedroom door closed to prevent them from getting in. DJ Dan the Music Man returns on the radio, reminding Steve of how sad his life was before all of this. Similar to how Afton convinced Rory to stay in the underground facility. Unlike Afton, DJ Dan the Music Man responds to Steve, telling him that everything he felt for his wife and kids was real. He just needs to let himself be happy. He explains the night terrors Steve experienced were created to inspire him while he worked on the games. He promises they'll stop and his robot family won't come inside the room. DJ Dan tells Steve to push a red button on the side of the radio, and once he does, everything is returned to normal. He sees Victoria and they kiss, as he's repeatedly stabbed within the vicinity of his heart. Now you might need this explained since it was a little confusing. After Steve rejected Phasma Entertainment's offer, they created Victoria's dating account and used it to lure Steve to the house, where they made a simulation in which he had a family he needed to support. This put pressure on him to make the games. He also never had any memory loss. That was just another lie from Phasma Entertainment. The loud ringing noises mentioned throughout the story are likely illusion discs, devices first introduced in the novel trilogy that produce a high-pitched ringing and create illusions. These were used to make Steve see the night terrors and his fake family. The similarities between this story and Dittophobia has some people thinking Phasma Entertainment found Afton's fear experiments and replicated them for Steve's simulation. Some key traits include the fake houses, creatures created from illusions, and both stories ending with the protagonist being convinced to stay in the simulation. The in-universe VR game also features the Nightmare animatronics and the Five Nights at Freddy's 4 testing facility, so it seems like Phasma Entertainment did find the experiments, since they're featured in their games. Steve's games are very crucial to the overarching story. If you've played Help Wanted, you likely knew some of this already. In that installment, it's revealed Phasma Entertainment hired an indie game developer to make a set of games based on the actual tragedies at Freddy's. This general concept pretty closely matches up with what we see in the short story Help Wanted, so it seems like it serves as a direct prequel to the VR game Help Wanted, explaining more about the indie games and their developer. When Steve appears in Help Wanted, he's even played by Five Nights at Freddy's real creator, Scott Cawthon, tying back to the parallels between Scott and Steve in the short story. If you're enjoying this video so far and want to support the channel, there's no better way to do so than becoming a member. This monthly membership gives you access to custom emojis and loyalty badges in comments and live chat. You also get video and project teasers, shoutouts at the end of our videos and in the descriptions, and priority replies to comments, all for the low price of $4.99 a month. Please consider joining the membership to support us. Alright, back to the video. Sometime after Steve Snodgrass is killed, his indie games are released by Phasma Entertainment. However, they only ended up tarnishing the brand further, so to undo that failed cover-up, they hired a VR development team to create a VR game poking fun at the indie games, essentially creating a cover-up for the cover-up. That's the story we experience in Help Wanted, the VR game, not the short story. After that installment, Phasma Entertainment successfully revitalized their image, and soon after they began construction on Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex, a giant entertainment venue where I'm sure nothing will go wrong. It's being constructed over the remains of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place, the location where the remaining possessed animatronics were burnt at the end of the 6th game. The tales from the Pizzaplex Epilogues take place early in the Pizzaplex's development, when the building is nothing more than a framework. Despite the building's current state, the new animatronics are delivered to the site, and one of the workers, Theo, signs for them. He goes into the delivery truck, which contains a collection of friendly-looking animatronics. They're all gleaming in a brand new perfection, except one. Theo says the Pizzaplex will need a new guitarist. And before we get an explanation, we cut to Gil, a member of the crew renovating the burnt pizza place, which Phasma Entertainment plans on turning into a museum or something. Gil sees the delivery, and most importantly, the strange animatronic in the truck. He approaches Theo and politely demands he hand over the weird robot, arguing it isn't meant for the Pizzaplex Entertainment like the other animatronics are. Gil takes the animatronic into the pizza place, and it's now that we get a proper description for it. It's an endoskeleton with a collection of metal rods, curved plates, and an impressive system of ball joints and pistons. It's not revealed until much later, but I'll just go ahead and spill the beans. This endoskeleton is the Mimic. Its head is described as shiny, but on the contrary, its body is dark and discolored, as if it survived some sort of fire. We don't know what events transpired between its origin story and the epilogues, but the upcoming game, Seeker of the Mimic, is starting to fill in some of those gaps. It's also mentioned that the Mimic has bent ears attached to his head that stick out like antennae. This, along with the burnt appearance, has led a lot of fans to believe that the Mimic is Burntrap, the Trap's physical form that appears in one of Security Breach's endings. He resembles Springtrap, albeit somehow even more broken down, but a lot of signs point to him being the Mimic's body. The previously mentioned black endo and bent ears can be seen on Burntrap, and it's worth noting the Mimic has never had ears outside of this appearance. Burntrap also curls his arm similarly to the Mimic in its origin story, and the pizza place is the same location he appears in. There are a lot more similarities, but I don't want to derail this video with all this Burntrap talk. If you want to learn even more, I'd recommend watching our video explaining the Mimic's story, and between you and me, that video is getting a remake soon. Gil plugs one of the Mimic's cables into his laptop and activates a cleanup protocol. Its white eyes begin to glow orange, the signature color of the Mimic. It then shifts its focus to Gil and opens its mouth. In a deep, flat voice, it says, "Awaiting instructions." This is one of the few times in the series where the Mimic speaks with its actual voice instead of copying someone else. Hopefully it has more dialogue in Seeker of the Mimic and other installments. Gil instructs it to break the limbs and heads off the endoskeletons in the pizza place and pile them up. But when the Mimic repeats those instructions, it doesn't include endoskeletons in its description. It begins to effortlessly disassemble the endoskeletons scattered throughout the building, but things quickly go south. One worker, Danny, witnesses the Mimic quickly tear off Gil's arms and blood gushes out of his sockets. It then twists and snaps his head off his body. Remember when the Mimic repeated Gil's instructions, it didn't include endoskeletons in the description of what to disassemble? I believe it intentionally ignored that command. Similar to how it twisted David's actions in its origin story, the Mimic is using the cleanup protocol to kill more people. Another crew enters the building to see what all the ruckus is, and the situation further delves into chaos. Danny quickly runs through the carnage. He's the only survivor who escapes the massacre, and he quickly orders some men to pour concrete over the doorway, sealing the Mimic inside. In the following epilogue, we're introduced to a group of teens at a nearby carnival. Most of these characters are pretty bland, so I won't waste time introducing them. We'll meet them all as they inevitably die. One of the dumb jocks suggests breaking into the Pizzaplex construction site, because who doesn't love ending a night of fun with trespassing onto an active construction site? The main character for most of the epilogues, Lucia, isn't as thrilled about the Pizzaplex as everyone else in town is. She's read stories about the old pizzerias, and even knows about the Pizzaplex being built over the pizza place, which has a questionable past, likely one it received due to the fire. After a brief debate, the group settles on exploring the Pizzaplex, and they notice the pizza place's roof under the construction site. They travel down there, ignoring the red flag of a concrete sealed doorway, and eventually breaking into the building through a vent chute. They land in a storage room where Lucia sees robotic arms, legs, and heads, likely disassembled by the Mimic. Speaking of which, they quickly find its pile of human and endoskeleton parts, and Lucia counts at least 11 bodies. Throughout the epilogues, this pile is referred to as a Tangle, which might connect to the Tangle, a character in Security Breach and Ruin who's an amalgamation of animatronic parts. Some people think this is hinting towards the Tangle being a much more evolved version of the Mimic's pile, and possessed by its victims. We'll talk about them more later. The teens return to the chute they entered through, only to find it's been crushed together, likely by the Mimic to prevent the teens from escaping. From here on out, the epilogues follow the teens being killed off one by one by the Mimic. And while I enjoy Mimic carnage as much as anyone, not that much happens in these epilogues, so I'll just skim through most of them and give you the important details. If you want a more in-depth summary of the epilogues, I'd again recommend watching our video explaining the Mimic. In the fourth epilogue, the teens find an operator's manual for the Mimic. According to the manual, the Mimic in the epilogues is either Mimic Model 1 or 2. We never learn more about these two models, but I assume the original Mimic is a Model 1, and the one in the epilogues is a Model 2. The Mimic endoskeletons can retract and expand their limbs, and they have a contracting torso, allowing them to fit into any mascot costume. The manual also mentions that if a Mimic is encountered, you should immediately disconnect its power source and disassemble it. In the following epilogue, the teens hear a voice coming from an old radio. They say they're trapped in a room behind the stage. They discover a hidden door back there, and opening it reveals a small room with mascot costumes. Some people think this room could be a safe room, one of the hidden rooms in the Freddy's locations where performers would dress up in spring-locked suits, and where Willie Mafton killed his victims. The Mimic lunges out from this room, now dressed in a monkey costume. The lights go out, since in the epilogues, the Mimic's presence affects electronics. But ultimately, this attack isn't effective and the teens escape. Despite the failed ambush, this scene still clearly demonstrates how clever the Mimic is. Aiding its cleverness is its new ability to copy voices. It's also a good time to mention how the epilogues characterize the Mimic. As previously discussed, it's very clever and sneaky. However, it isn't fast, allowing the teens to easily escape it. This is something we can see in Ruin. During the Mimic's ending chase, it can't match Cassie's speed and doesn't move very fast until the ending cutscene. In the next epilogue, Lucia finds a notebook from the Phasma Entertainment animatronic creation team, who built the animatronics across the Freddy's pizzerias. According to the notebook, when the team created the Mimic line, they didn't want to have to program in every show routine. So they programmed the Mimic to watch and learn, observing other routines and mimicking them. However, the programming was tricky, and it seems like the original Mimic began copying people in unintended ways. Likely similar to how it copied things David did and twisted them into brutal murder methods. The notebook is smudged, so Lucia can't make out all the words. What she can read implies the Mimic Endos misinterpreted instructions and could cause a potential disaster, so they plan to deactivate them. Once again, it's possible Seeker of the Mimic will further explain what went wrong and why they were deactivated. The Mimic is still trying to trick the teens on the radio. They figure it must have seen a hide-and-seek game and can't reason that the trick wouldn't work more than once. They decide to use this to their advantage. Since they know where the Mimic is, they set a trap to lock it in the storage room. The plan goes well until the bait, a teenager named Jace, breaks the vent he's escaping through, falling back into the storage room and into the arms of the Mimic, who promptly tears him apart. The 7th epilogue lets us see the Mimic's perspective, allowing us to get a glimpse of this endoskeleton's mind. It describes things in a very robotic manner, referring to Jace as a unit that had been crawling in a tunnel, aka the vent. It takes count of all the doors, boxes, and toys, possibly because Gil had told it to take inventory before it brutally murdered everyone. The Mimic notices a doll with pigtails, which is likely a plush baby. These circus baby dolls live in the nightmares of anyone who has played Help Wanted or Help Wanted 2. Similar to the endoskeletons in humans, it tears apart the plush and piles it up. The Mimic killing a plush baby is part of the reason it's my favorite character. Thank you for avenging all my failed attempts at the plush baby levels. It then tries to open the door, but thanks to the teens, it's locked. It uses more force, but only ends up tearing off the handle. It then reaches through the hole and opens the door. The Mimic is blocked by a table, which the teens place there as a barricade. And since it has no established protocol for getting through a solid wall, it gives up. It recalls watching Jace crawling through the vent, so it decides to copy him and exit the room that way. Its head fits into the vent, but its shoulders don't. The Mimic says it simply needs to take a different form, and it's programmed to take any form necessary to fulfill its functioning. It proceeds to reconfigure itself and crawl into the vent, using the sharp tips of its fingers to pierce the metal, and further compressing and contracting itself. The last two teens, Lucia and Kelly, dress up in mascot costumes to avoid the Mimic. Kelly wears a blue dog costume, and Lucia narrowly avoids putting on a Springlock court jester suit. The court jester was previously used by the Mimic to scoop out Harry's brain in its origin story. Lucia ditches the court jester due to the lethal Springlocks inside, and wears a much safer rodent costume. The girls plan on grabbing some endoskeleton arms and using them to break the concrete, trapping them in the pizza place. The Mimic interrupts them, but Kelly and Lucia stand still in the costumes until the Mimic leaves. Or that's what they think, but after further inspection, Lucia notices a nearby Mushroom Man costume that wasn't in there before. Similar to the court jester, this costume was also in the Mimic's origin story, and was worn by the endoskeleton when it killed Glenn. The teens continue playing the waiting game until the Mushroom Man starts moving around. It walks towards them, and something crawls out of the back of the suit. Instead of the upright form the Mimic usually takes, it has a new appearance, an abomination of metal joints and wires, vaguely resembling a mutated spider. This disturbing version of the Mimic scares Kelly into running, but Lucia yells at her to stop. She freezes, and the Mimic squirms towards the blue dog costume Kelly is hiding inside, studying it and tapping its foot. Lucia realizes it's probably confused because the costume wasn't in there when it entered the room. The Mimic backs away from the costume, turning like it's leaving, but instead, it quickly peels open the costume and shoves itself inside with Kelly. She screams as the Mimic crushes her inside the blue dog. The room is filled with the horrific sounds of crunching and snapping, followed by spongy, wet splintering sounds. After one final crunch, Kelly stops screaming, and the blue dog folds in on itself and collapses into a bloody pile of fur. It then stands upright, and the Mimic walks out of Lucia's sight. In the final epilogue, Lucia decides the only way she's getting out alive is by killing the Mimic. She makes a plan to trick it into climbing into the court jester suit and spring-locking it. She goes back to the hidden room behind the stage where the court jester is, and begins disabling the other costume zippers, so the Mimic's only option will be to climb in the court jester suit. As she's doing this, the costumes in the room begin to sway, and she has the disturbing realization that the Mimic is hiding in one of them. She continues disabling the costumes, and on the 10th one, her luck finally runs out. The room's dim bulb glints off something metal within a dark brown gopher costume. The Mimic leaps out of it, its limbs extend and expand, searching the other costumes. Lucia ducks between a blackbird and a purple lion costume, both of which are references. The blackbird suit seems to be a reference to Blackbird, a character from Fazbear Frights, and the purple lion is the costume the Mimic wore in its origin story when it killed Dominic. Now all 3 of the Mimic's origin story murder costumes have appeared in the epilogues. Thanks to Lucia's tampering, only 2 costumes are usable. A flat-furred Holy Tiger costume, likely a reference to David's tiger obsession, and the Springlock Court Jester. None of that matters since the Mimic finds Lucia first, and begins to crawl into the mouth of her costume in an attempt to crush her. By this point, the Mimic has abandoned the cleanup protocol, having crushed Kelly in the blue dog costume and now attempting to similarly kill Lucia. She narrowly escapes the suit and it falls over the Mimic, who flails its arms trying to get control of the costume. Lucia quickly wraps a rope around the costume's legs and the Mimic topples over. It reconfigures itself into a worm-like form and begins extracting itself from the suit, then reconfigures into its upright form. Lucia puts her head in the court jester suit and baits the Mimic into the costume, then quickly exits as it crawls inside. Channeling her inner Edwin, she grabs a metal rod and begins beating the court jester costume. But the springlocks don't activate, despite how easily triggered they are. Springlocks clearly do what the plot demands, because slight laughter and cupcake bites activate them, but not repeated bashing with a metal rod. The Mimic begins climbing out through the mouth of the costume, and a compressed piece of metal enlarges itself and morphs into the Mimic's head. Its gaze locks on Lucia and it opens its mouth. She quickly holds the metal rod like a spear and stabs into the Mimic's mouth. This jolts its head back, finally setting off the springlocks and filling the room with a clamoring cascade of metal striking metal. The court jester violently moves all at once as the Mimic is impaled by the springlocks, and the suit is soaked in the endoskeleton's oil, paralleling how the blue dog costume was soaked in Kelly's blood. There are a lot of callbacks in the Mimic's defeat. Lucia beating the Mimic with a metal rod is reminiscent of how Edwin also beat it with a metal rod, which led to its murderous behavior. The court jester was also the first costume the Mimic wore in its origin story. Using the costume to defeat the Mimic in the final epilogue is a nice reverse of how its story began. After the springlocks have done their work, the Mimic is left writhing inside the court jester, its head protruding from the costume's mouth, but the light in its eyes is fading. Its movements are frantic, it's now the victim. Lucia fears if she waits longer, the Mimic will find a way to self-repair. She reaches behind its neck, and remembering what she learned in the user's manual, she flips the deactivation switch. The same switch that was also used by Edwin to activate the Mimic in its origin story. It stops moving, and its murder spree is finally over, at least for now. With the pizza place Mimic free, Lucia manages to escape through a window in the ladies' bathroom. She's rescued by some construction workers and smiles, finally free from the pizza place and the murderous endoskeleton within. After the epilogues, the Pizzaplex is fully constructed, and the events of Frailty happen sometime later. Unlike the other stories, this is a direct continuation of Fazbear Frights, the book series preceding Tales. Frights was more focused on the original installments in the series, and instead of setting up the future, it answered some mysteries from the past. Frailty was the first Tales story released, serving as the bridge between the 2 series. This story isn't all that important, and I don't want to waste your time, so let's review the key points. The story follows Jessica, a teenage girl working at a hospital. She once had a life, a home, a family, but she says she gave it all up, making the wrong choice in the past. It's implied throughout the story she fell victim to Eleanor, the main villain in the Fazbear Frights series. Eleanor is a creature that feeds off human suffering, and for the past 3 decades, she's been coming in and out of the ball pit from Into the Pit, which is a graveyard for souls who were victim of a wicked wrongness. One spirit named Jake theorizes that either Eleanor caused this or was created from it, but the books leave it ambiguous. The interactive novel, Return to the Pit, implies she existed prior to the Freddy's murders. Her blood samples are found in the pit by Detective Larson, who collects 30 samples for the 30 years Eleanor has been in the pit. He connects the dates from the samples to bizarre incidents like missing persons and strange events. There are multiple cases where parents have reported their teens finding a metal clown mannequin shortly before they went missing. Not every teen who went missing is connected to the mannequin, but the disappearances coincide with the time periods associated with the blood samples. This is expanded upon when we learn that Eleanor was behind the events of stories such as Out of Stock, 1:35 AM, Step Closer, Hide and Seek, and more. The story, To Be Beautiful, elaborates upon the teens who find the metal clown mannequin, which is later confirmed to be Eleanor. Sarah is one of these unfortunate teens who stumbles across her and takes her home. Eleanor promises to make Sarah beautiful and tells her to always wear the silver heart pendant she gives her. When it inevitably falls off, Sarah's new beautiful appearance begins to turn to trash. And it's revealed that Eleanor had been cutting up her body, replacing it with garbage, and using the pendant to make her appear human. Eleanor then steals Sarah's original identity and leaves her to collapse into a heap of trash. It's implied later that the pendant Eleanor uses was stolen from a man by the name of Dr. Talbert, or some sort of copy of the pendant. the latter of which seems to be more likely as it's implied there's multiple pendants. The pendant is made out of remnant, which according to Frights is a haunted metal. It's further described as the mixing of the tangible with intangible, of the memory with the present. It makes things and people that were lost almost real again. Eleanor describes remnant as power, life, and eternal. So it seems like this paranormal substance gives her power and lets her live forever. Anyways, back to Tales, Jessica has a lot of similarities with Eleanor's victims like Sarah. Just like Sarah, she has a heart-shaped pendant in her possession, and throughout the story, old rubbish begins to fall off her body, similar to how Sarah fell apart into trash. She also mentions that once, being lovely was all she wanted. So it's possible that just like Sarah, she made a deal with Eleanor to be beautiful, and instead, her body was cut up and replaced with trash. To redeem herself for a past mistake, she went to work with sick children at a hospital, and she'd cut the pendant over them, which transfers its remnant and heals them. Toward the end of the story, Jessica tries to use what little remains of the pendant to live her life, starting by going to prom with the boy she likes, Robert. When they kiss, grease from Jessica's trash gets on his face. Robert doesn't take this too well, and Jessica runs from prom and back to the hospital, where she uses the rest of the pendant to save a sick girl named April, sacrificing herself in the process. When the hospital staff enters the room, all they find is a pile of metal and a healthy April. This seems to mark the end of Eleanor's story, with what appears to be your last remaining victim finally dying. At least 3 decades after the Mimic's origin story, Edwin Murray returns in the Storyteller, now at the age of 64. After David's death, Edwin ran as far away as he could all across the world until eventually he ran out of money, and had to demand that Fazbear Entertainment honor the buyout of his company. Now he's one of Fazbear's board members, and he has to deal with Mr. Burrows, the 35-year-old board chairman with a very high opinion of himself. Edwin doesn't want to listen to Mr. Burrows or even be at the meeting, but he says he has to keep the board thinking straight. Case in point, Mr. Burrows suggests firing the Mega Pizzaplex creative development team to save some money. Edwin and Mr. Burrows fight over this for a bit, but Mr. Burrows and the board decide to replace the creative team with the Storyteller, an artificial intelligence program that takes pieces of previously created stories and rearranges them into new scenarios for VR, AR, and arcade games. Despite this story being written around 2021, this lends some commentary to the sadly modern practices of AI replacing creative jobs. Mr. Burrows gives Edwin a consultant role on the Storyteller project, which personally I believe is to further insult him, but Edwin knows a lot of things could go wrong with the Storyteller and decides to keep it together so he can prevent a tragedy. The board continues to ignore his concerns and instead discusses what the Storyteller would look like. Mr. Burrows mentions that maybe they'll let the Storyteller decide its appearance, and I'm sure that won't be important later. As the board members chatter on, Edwin zones out and reflects on his past mistakes. This story came out before the Mimic's origin story, so it never outright mentions David or the Mimic, but with that context, the scene is much more impactful. It's mentioned that he keeps vintage Freddy's posters in his home as a way to punish himself for his past mistakes that eventually led to David's death. Back in the present, the board decides to move forward with the Storyteller, and Edwin gets a strong sense of deja vu, likely as a reference to the Mimic, Edwin's own AI program that went horribly wrong. The Storyteller's development goes by at the speed of light. Everyone except Edwin is thrilled to be working on it. He isn't allowed to see the Storyteller's specs, which makes him nervous. Edwin rarely gave opinions on the project. He suggested that the Storyteller be refined to a remote part of the Pizzaplex, to give it a mysterious aura. In reality, he suggested that in case it became a problem. Regardless, he's ignored and is constructed in the center of the Pizzaplex's atrium. The design team decides the Storyteller should be housed inside a tree, but they argue about what type. Edwin suggests a baobab tree, one of the longest living trees in the world and the hardiest, thriving in the harshest of conditions. The board likes this idea, so a giant baobab tree was constructed in the Pizzaplex's atrium, although the bright and shiny vibrant yellow tree hardly resembles any real tree. LEDs made up the tree's root system, which stretched out from the tree and sunk into the floor. The roots are actually a network of wiring connecting the Storyteller to all the story-driven attractions and feeding the information to the appropriate hardware, meaning that every animatronic in the Pizzaplex would get instructions from the Storyteller. Edwin isn't allowed inside the tree, which bothers him, but Mr. Burrows claims that only the construction team is allowed in there. Edwin doesn't trust him and decides he needs to see what's going on for himself. He gathers up some cryptid memos referring to the construction, and finds out that larger parts of the Storyteller are being transferred into the tree later that night. Luckily, Edwin's status at the company gives him access to every part of the Pizzaplex, allowing him to get a glimpse of the Storyteller. He hides in the Monty Golf lobby and observes the construction crew moving something that takes his breath away, and not in a good way. He has a mental breakdown and remembers a horrific event filled with blood, possibly the events of Secret of the Mimic. Edwin snaps back to reality and hides as the construction workers head in his direction. He manages to avoid them and returns to his vantage point. He now describes the object that caused him so much distress, a giant metal white tiger head. This blast from the past is a clear reference to David's white tiger plush. He's understandably rattled by this and leaves. It turns out Edwin isn't as stealthy as he thinks. The security notices him and reports him to Mr. Burrows, who watches his mental breakdown on the security cameras. He doesn't believe Edwin is a problem just yet. He can't even get inside the tree, as Mr. Burrows makes sure only himself and a select few of the construction members had access to it. The next day, Edwin confronts Mr. Burrows, asking him what program the Storyteller is running to create its stories. He says it's a simple template-styled software that rearranges parts of previously created stories for VR, AR, and arcades. When Edwin asks who's programming the Storyteller, Mr. Burrows waves him off and tells him not to worry. Unfortunately, Edwin can't find anything about the Storyteller's program before it's activated. The big reveal is a big letdown. Considering everyone's already seen the giant tree, it's more like a high-tech tree lighting. But at least they have a Storyteller-shaped cake. That's awesome and I want it for my birthday now. Unfortunately, that's the only good thing that comes from the Storyteller. Edwin notices issues with the animatronics right away. First, in the Queen of the Roxy Raceway, Roxanne Wolf. She's a punk rock animatronic whose self-centered and competitive attitude never sat right with Edwin. But it was what Phasma Entertainment wanted for the character. She had always enjoyed poking fun at others' insecurities because of her own deep-seated self-esteem issues. But when the Storyteller activates, Roxanne Wolf turns into a bully, verbally attacking anyone and anything around her. As if her lack of empathy was morphing into a more aggressive form of psychological cruelty. There's more issues with Chica. While the Glamrock Chica from the games is white and pink, this Chica more closely resembles her original form, described as a yellow, bib-wearing chicken with Mr. Cupcake. She has a gluttonous nature, especially pushy when it comes to getting pizza, but she's still one of the more loving Phasma Entertainment characters. However, similar to Roxy, she begins to act up, and her loving persona is replaced by a snarky one. No longer interested in food, she's obsessed with getting attention. She demands that Mr. Cupcake show her more deference, and he also begins acting strange, taking on the behavior of a vicious terrier, possibly as a reference to Mr. Cupcake in the movie. It's never explained why Glamrock Chica in this story is so different from the one in the games, especially since in the prequel story, VIP, Chica has her security breach design. There are still some references to a yellow Glamrock Chica in the games, with yellow strollers scattered throughout the Pizzaplex, some yellow Glamrock Chica signs, specks of yellow around Chica's hand, and Mr. Cupcake can be found in Glamrock Chica's green room. He also appears in Help Wanted 2's Pizza 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 food prep level. A later story, Bobby Dots Part 2, does mention a damaged Glamrock Chica in the sewers. So maybe the yellow Glamrock Chica was destroyed sometime before Security Breach, and replaced by the one we see in the games. Anyway, moving on, Montgomery Gator exhibits disturbing changes as well. Monty's an alligator animatronic, and as part of his extravagant image, he's prone to smashing things. He's dramatic, but harmless, at least at first. The Storyteller messes with him, making his rampages more violent, and in between tantrums, he withdraws into depressive silence that drives children to tears. It's also worth noting that a Bonnie Bull animatronic is also mentioned in the story, so it seems like Glamrock Bonnie is still alive. However, later it's shown that Monty has a green room in Rockstar Row, so I'm not exactly sure what's going on. It sounds like there might have been some communication errors between Scott Cawthon and the writer. Anyways, all of the Pizzaplex animatronics begin to change. Whatever trait is normal for them is shifted to the dark side. None of the characters turn homicidal, but the change is noticeable to Edwin. Mr. Burrows dismisses these concerns, saying the Storyteller is just amping up conflict. But Edwin isn't convinced. People who have played the games will likely recognize Roxy and Monty's Storyteller altered personalities, since that's how they behave in the games. So it seems like we have the Storyteller to thank for Roxy's cruel personality and Monty's destructive rampages. Soon after, the entire Pizzaplex begins malfunctioning, sparking crossed wires, shorted out electrical systems, pipe leaks, random animatronic shutdowns, sound system static, characters getting their voices mixed up, locked doors that should have been unlocked, and unlocked doors that should have been locked. None of these issues are inherently dangerous, but the sheer number of problems screams danger. No one else seems to care about these issues, so Edwin decides to get into the Storyteller's tree to learn more. The entrance is locked and hidden, so Edwin goes to the Phasma Archives building to find out more about the tree. He discovers the records, which reveal a maintenance entrance to the tree inside the Pizzaplex's roller coaster. This connects to some catwalks which lead into the tree. Edwin uses this to get inside and sees the Storyteller in all of its glory, or horror according to him. He now notices that the giant metal white tiger head has a blue and green eye. Unlike a real tiger, it doesn't have any stripes, and its nose and mouth are the same color as the rest of the painted metal. Its teeth are silver and lit by blinking lights connected to the Storyteller's hardware. The tiger bust is mounted on one curved yellow painted wall of the trunk's interior, and has 4 arms jutting from its neck, 2 facing up and 2 down. The floor and wall are covered in white LED lights, illuminating the tiger that reminds Edwin of his past. He has another panic attack, but pushes it aside. Even so, he briefly worries the tiger will come to life and attack him. These fears might be connected to the similar white tiger costume in Secret of the Mimic, possibly meaning Edwin encountered it before. He realizes the tiger is stationary, and quickly finds the Storyteller's terminal. It's password protected, but he still learns all he needs to know. Edwin's worst fears are confirmed. The Storyteller is running a program called Mimic 1. He knew it all along, as evidenced by a sense of deja vu when Mr. Burrows proposed the Storyteller. The reveal of the Mimic 1 program being behind the Storyteller helps explain why Mr. Burrows was so determined to keep Edwin away from it, and why it's a white tiger. Mr. Burrows had previously mentioned letting the Storyteller choose its appearance, so naturally, the Mimic chose David's white tiger. This also adds extra significance to what Edwin had previously said about baobab trees. He stated they were one of the longest living trees in the world, and were able to survive in the harshest conditions. This directly ties back to how the Mimic is one of the oldest animatronics in the series, predating even the classic animatronics. And it references just how durable it is. It survived Edwin's beating, and spoiler alert, it survived being spring-locked in the Epilogues, and in Ruin, it's shown to be very durable, even denting the elevator door when it closes on it. Speaking of Ruin, this story helps explain how the Mimic can access information about the Pizzaplex during the DLC. Thanks to the Storyteller, the Mimic 1 program was uploaded to the Pizzaplex's systems. Back to the story, Edwin thinks about how the Pizzaplex is filled with issues thanks to the Mimic 1 program, and he says it was happening again. It's never explained what exactly this means, since in the Mimic's origin story, it never corrupted any animatronics or systems. Edwin may be referring to the upcoming game, Secret of the Mimic, where it seems like the Mimic corrupts some animatronic characters. After this discovery, Edwin continues sneaking into the tree, and after 5 nights, he's exhausted. I guess you could say he spent 5 nights at Freddy's. Bad jokes aside, he wakes up in his ratty apartment, totally depressed and just being a bummer, thinking about his dead wife and son. I wouldn't have discussed this scene, except he mentions a small item on his dresser. Edwin says he knew he should have thrown it away, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. It's the only thing he has left of a time that he shouldn't have been allowed to forget. It's never explained, but I think this is David's white tiger plush. It explained why he couldn't bring himself to get rid of it. It's tragic that all these years later, he keeps a reminder of his dead son so close to him. Moving on from dead kids, we follow Mr. Burrows as he continues being one of my least favorite characters. For about half a page, he just thinks about how much he hates Phasma Entertainment and the Pizzaplex. He might be in such a downer mood because he's having to go to the Pizzaplex to see the effects of the Storyteller for himself. Employees had reported shows morphing strangely, and several characters associated with various attractions like Monty's Gator Golf, Roxy Raceway, Bazzer Blast, and Bonnie Bowl were exhibiting unusual behaviors. Mr. Burrows still insists the Storyteller is working perfectly fine, and instead blames Edwin. He goes to Rockstar Row, where the animatronics hang out between shows. Mr. Burrows witnesses Glamrock Freddy acting like a spoiled brat, trying to tug a Freddy Fazbear plush away from a little girl. After letting the plush go, Freddy bizarrely begins to cry. He's seen enough, and as Mr. Burrows is running out of the Pizzaplex, he trips on a toddler sitting on the floor and falls. His view from the floor shows him the Storyteller's branches, and he realizes that Edwin is using the catwalks to get into the tree. Mr. Burrows has the tech team install cameras, resulting in a clear video of Edwin sneaking into the tree. He then seals the door behind him, trapping him inside the Storyteller's tree, which has no ventilation system, leaving him to suffocate. Mr. Burrows reasons that Edwin is an expensive and troublesome employee who is likely causing all the Pizzaplex's issues. A week later, Mr. Burrows can't get his mind off him and is puzzled when there's no updates on Edwin or the Storyteller. He reasons someone would have heard Edwin by now, so he assumes he somehow snuck out of the tree. Mr. Burrows enters the Storyteller's tree to figure out what's going on, and finds quite a bizarre sight. Construction paper is covering the walls, and every piece has strange drawings of stick figures, squiggles, squares, loops, triangles within triangles, and mathematical equations tangled up in all the symbols. The triangles within triangles might be connected to the triangle symbols tied to Secret of the Mimic. Anyways, written all over this nonsense are the words "I'm sorry." This is likely Edwin apologizing to David, or the Mimic, or apologizing for creating the Mimic. This guy has so much to be sorry about, it's hard to nail down what he's referring to. After circling the tree, Mr. Burrows finds Edwin's body, half buried under construction paper, having suffocated while scrambling yet another stick figure. Mr. Burrows doesn't fare much better. It turns out that when he locked Edwin inside the tree, it overrode all the tree's functions, so Mr. Burrows can't leave the tree either. He starts screaming and banging on the walls, trying to get someone's attention, but the Pizzaplex is too loud for anyone to hear him. He figures if he breaks the Storyteller, the attractions would malfunction and someone would enter the tree to fix it. However, even when ripping the cables out of the Storyteller, it remains functioning. He tears off all the arms and beats the tiger's head, but nothing happens. The story ends with Mr. Burrows screaming for help as he slowly dies from a lack of oxygen. Next up is Tiger Rock, yet another Mimic story. Unlike the other ones, this isn't as important, so the summary will be much more brief. Our main character is Kai, who goes to the Mega Pizzaplex with his friends Asher and Todd. Asher is excited to see the Storyteller, and while Kai reassures him it's not going anywhere, turns out it is. The tree is now enveloped in plastic, and a rope barrier surrounds its base. A Pizzaplex employee tells the kids the tree is being taken down after some kind of glitch. This is partially true. The Storyteller has been causing issues across the Pizzaplex, but Edwin and Mr. Burrow's death inside the tree likely play into its removal. The tree being taken down also explains why we never see it in the games. Speaking of the games, Kai describes the tree in a very interesting way, which might connect back to one of the biggest mysteries of Security Breach, the Tangle. While the epilogues hint at the Tangle being the Mimic's victims, this story implies it might be the remains of the Storyteller. Kai says the tree looks like a monster, and he could easily see it uprooting itself and stomping through the Pizzaplex, using its branches to grab children. That's very reminiscent of how the Tangle uses its tentacles in Security Breach to attack Gregory and Burntrap. And the idea of the Storyteller stomping through the Pizzaplex reminds me of how the Tangle destroyed the building after Security Breach. More evidence to support this is how similar to the Storyteller, the Tangle's main head, Funtime Freddy, is a white animal. But that is a whole other can of worms, which we might revisit in a future video. Kai and his friends decide to check out the Pizzaplex's VR booth. An LED sign advertises that for today only, there's an AR experience showcasing what the Pizzaplex will look like in 10 years. By the way, the story uses AR and VR interchangeably, just want to clarify that in case you got confused. The Pizzaplex's AR unit has a bright red base surrounded by a glass dome. In the center is a large gold chair that the AR user sits in while wearing a net-like headband covered in sensory nodes, making the AR experience feel very real. Kai enters the AR future experience, and somehow even flashier than the modern Pizzaplex. He meets future Glamrock Freddy, who's more realistic than the Freddy we know and love. He takes Kai through the future Pizzaplex, passing futuristic versions of attractions such as Bonnie Bowl, Roxy Raceway, and even a log ride, which seems to be based on the scrapped log ride from Ruin and Help Wanted 2. Another new attraction is Tiger Rock Trampoline, and they encounter Tiger Rock himself. He's a metal white tiger with a blue and green eye. This is pretty clearly another form of the Mimic, based on how similar Tiger Rock is to the Storyteller. But this is the Mimic in style. He also speaks more fluidly and with some swag. Quite a contrast to the ugly, cave monster mimic endoskeleton. Freddy leaves Kai with Tiger Rock, who seems much more interested in him than Freddy was. He observes Kai from head to toe before shaking his hand so hard it hurts his shoulder. Tiger Rock speaks to him in Hawaiian, which impresses Kai, who is half Hawaiian. Tiger Rock knows lots of things and loves learning, saying it's all about how you pay attention and how you take in what you see and hear. This is a clear callback to how the Mimic observes others and copies what it sees. He tells Kai he can show him how things work around here, and takes him to a conveyor belt, where we're introduced to the helper bots. These bots take all sorts of forms, large and small, human and animal shaped, and boxy, utilitarian shaped. One of them even carries around a fancy broom. I believe these helper bots are meant to be early versions of the staff bots. The only mention of them in Tales are the alien bots in Phaser Blast, and instead of the Pizzaplex being run by staff bots, there's still human workers. These books seem to take place before all the human employees were replaced by staff bots. So my theory is that helper bots are some sort of early version of the staff that Fazbear Entertainment added to the AR simulation before being introduced to the real Pizzaplex. These helper bots don't do anything in the story, I just think they were added as a little staff bot history. Or maybe we'll see them in Secret of the Mimic. After all, the demo did feature a male bot. Anyway, as the boy and Tiger duo continue through the behind the scenes area, Tiger Rock's grip on Kai's arm starts to hurt. And to make things worse, he yanks on his arm when they go through the Pizzaplex crowd. As they're about to go down some slides, Tiger Rock compresses his paw around Kai's arm, and something pops. Kai's had enough and flees Tiger Rock down a slide into a futuristic Monty Golf. He follows him here, and asks if they're playing hide and seek, saying he learned how to play long ago. This ties back to the Epilogues, where the teens speculated the Mimic had witnessed a hide and seek game. The two run around some more until Tiger Rock catches Kai and tightly grabs his arms. Luckily for him, the VR time is up, and Kai's returned to the real world, or so he thinks. He begins seeing weird things, like white cats and owls with blue and green eyes, and even a clock with a humanoid face, and of course, blue and green eyes. He quickly realizes he's still trapped inside the VR simulation, which is now replicating the real world. He's ambushed in his bedroom by his sister's stuffed animals, who with their surprising strength, restrain him and try to tear him limb by limb. All while Tiger Rock watches from the closet. Kai screams to wake up, and it seems to work. He finds himself in a whirlpool of sound and color, and manages to see the Pizzaplex. It suddenly morphs into the future Pizzaplex, and a near-transparent Tiger Rock is overlaid on the scene. Kai keeps screaming to wake up, and sees the VR booth's glass wall. He also sees a girl and her grandfather holding a strange-looking doll. His eyes widen when he sees the freaky doll, and then suddenly he's free from the VR simulation. He reunites with his friends for real this time. They tell him he was trapped in there for 5 hours, and the techs couldn't figure out how to open the booth or break it without hurting him. Kai says he wants to forget about the experience, but Tiger Rock has other plans. Later that night, he erupts from below Kai's window, quickly grabs his forearms, and rips his arms off. As Kai loses consciousness, he watches Tiger Rock flee into the night with his arms. Now this ending is very confusing, considering the Mimic is still trapped in the sinkhole, and Tiger Rock isn't a real animatronic. Maybe Kai is having side effects from the AR experience, allowing Tiger Rock to still interact with him in the real world? Regardless, something interesting is Tiger Rock's method of ripping off Kai's arms seems to be mimicking how Mr. Burroughs ripped off the Storyteller's arms. The story Nexie coincides with Tiger Rock. Again, the story isn't super important, so we'll just skim through it. Our main character is Astrid, a young girl who is obsessed with the Pizzaplex's Buddytronics. And honestly, I can't blame her. These things are basically robotic Build-A-Bears. How cool is that? There's Buddytronics for characters such as Funtime Foxy, DJ Music Man, Montgomery Gator, and Circus Baby. I would kill for a Mimic or Tiger Rock Buddytronic, even if they would likely kill me. Astrid's father's a carpenter who builds Swedish furniture by hand and travels all over to sell his work, leaving Astrid with her farfar, which is Swedish for grandpa. Her mom left the family when Astrid was little and she doesn't remember her. While her dad and farfar are old-fashioned, making all their own machines and food themselves, farfar still wants to let Astrid choose what she's interested in. So on her birthday, he helps her pay for a Buddytronic. When they go to buy it, the Pizzaplex is in absolute chaos, with employees running around in a high-pitched squeal in the air. The source of all this chaos is the Storyteller. Astrid mentions a boy in a glass dome, and this seems to be Kai, trapped in the VR booth during the events of Tiger Rock. They're told the Buddytronic store is closing on account of the Pizzaplex systems going haywire. But Farfar guilt trips the employees into letting Astrid get her Buddytronic. She designs the perfect doll and names her Lexie. But as it's assembled, something goes wrong. Because of how bad the system's glitching, Lexie comes out horrifically deformed. All of the parts Astrid picked have been added in really strange ways that just makes the doll ugly, which is extra hurtful considering she based the doll's appearance on her absent mother. The employees tell Astrid to come back when the system isn't glitching, and they'll get her a good doll. But Astrid thinks about how walking away from the doll would be just like how her mother left her. Apparently Astrid was also an accident child, so that's a fun thing to think about when you've accidentally created a horrific doll. All of this convinces Astrid to keep the Buddytronic. They turn on the doll, whose name was even messed up, and is now named Nexie. She's a pretty smart doll, even impressing Farfar and winning Astrid's heart. But don't get too attached, because this doll is not a good guy. People look at Nexie weirdly as they leave the Pizzaplex, but Astrid is proud to have such a unique friend. They hear cheers from the VR booth, likely because this is when Kai escapes Tiger Rock's simulation. Oh, remember how I said Kai had seen a girl, her grandpa, and a weird doll? Those were actually Astrid, Farfar, and Nexie. It's also a good time to address that Nexie might be corrupted by the Mimic 1 program. Her creation was influenced by the Storyteller going haywire, which might explain why she acts strange and gets violent throughout the story. It's possible that similar to the Glamrocks in the Storyteller, the Mimic 1 program is altering Nexie's personality. Nexie's uncomfortable with how she looks, thinking she's ugly, and this begins to rub off on Astrid, making her view herself as ugly too. Her main goal in the story is fixing Nexie, which mostly involves getting her a new endoskeleton. But the only place with all the parts needed for that is the Fazbear repair facility under the Pizzaplex. I'm assuming this is supposed to be the parts and service and endoskeleton warehouse area of the Pizzaplex. Astrid and Nexie break into the Pizzaplex's repair facility and they find an endoskeleton they like. So pretty straightforward ending. Astrid gets Nexie a new endoskeleton, she's beautiful now, yay, everyone's happy. If you're thinking this, you clearly haven't read enough Five Nights at Freddy's books, because there's always a horrific twist at the end. Turns out this endoskeleton wasn't for Nexie, it was for Astrid. The next day at school, a boy named Remy witnesses the new Astrid enter the classroom, and it's quite the horrific sight. Pieces of Astrid's skin have been cut apart and elongated to fit over a body that was taller and broader than her old one. Her face had been cut off in one piece, now expanded to fit over a large skull. Her skin is almost translucent because of how much it's been stretched out. It's a pasty white color and dried blood surrounds the seams of the skin. Oh, this is so gross. If I have to read about this, then you'll have to hear it. The new Astrid sits quietly in her seat and Nexie seems content. The story ends with her hugging her doll, saying she's finally perfect. It seems like all along, Nexie had been trying to change Astrid's appearance, not her own. Again, this behavior is likely a side effect of the Mimic 1 program. With Nexie out of the way, we'll shift our focus from the Mimic to Glitchtrap, who may or may not be the same character anyways. We have a theory video in the works about Glitchtrap's true identity, so keep an eye out for that. The story GGY focuses on him and the mysterious Patient 46, a character discussed in Security Breach's retro CDs, who seems to be responsible for the animatronic's hostile behavior in Security Breach. GGY follows Tony, an investigative 12-year-old boy, who goes to school with his two best friends. They're assigned a writing prompt focusing on a mystery, and they give each other crazy pen names. Childhood friend goes by Boots, and their new friend who just joined the school a couple of months ago goes by Dr. Rabbit, or Rab for short. Tony's name is Tarbell, named after Ida Tarbell, an actual reporter in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'll still refer to him as Tony, I just wanted to mention that cool reference. Tony contemplates his friendship, mentioning that Boots still acts like a little kid, while Rab likes to goof off, but also says deep and interesting things. Multiple times he's seen him with a rigid expression on his face, as if he was contemplating something intense. It's mentioned that Rab is small, pale, and has big brown eyes and chocolate-colored hair. I'm not sure why I'd bring that up though, it's not like it'll be important later. The boys head to the Pizzaplex, where they mention all the attractions from the games, along with the roller coaster from previous stories, directly tying this installment to those. They then go to the West Arcade. Instead of getting any Pizzaplex treats like Chica Chowder or Fizzy Faz, we're ordered an exposition dump about Tony's dad being convicted of stealing money from his company. Tony wanted to investigate who had really stolen the money, but his dad made him promise to drop it, which leads me to believe that his dad actually did steal that money, but hey, that's just a theory. Anyways, this makes Tony even more determined to solve mysteries. So when he sees a player on the Pizzaplex arcades named GGY, who has outscored all other players by millions of points, he's determined to figure out who this is. Players of the games might recognize GGY from the arcades in Security Breach, which are directly referenced in the story, and the achievement in Help Wanted 2, which is gained by beating all the high scores in the minigames. Tony notes that GGY hasn't played all the arcades, but the ones they have, they've blown all the other scores out of the water, which again matches up with Security Breach. I like the consistency here a lot. After asking around about GGY, some girls named Kenzie and Crystal point Tony to Alex Brandon Campbell, another guy in the arcade high scores. Axel was subtly introduced in Security Breach. His initials, ABC, can be seen on the high scores, and the story confirms that's him. A couple of days later, Tony returns to the Pizzaplex arcade to find Axel. Instead, he witnesses Monty breakdancing, which I only mentioned because I found it funny, and I think it's a reference to the Security Breach plushie gift Steel made for Daco's charity stream. Tony eventually finds Axel, who is rude and not very helpful. All he knows is that GGY is a ghost. No one has seen them at the arcade or knows who they are. Tony runs into one of the Fazcade attendants named Finbar. He's a nice guy and an underrated side character. He's Irish, which I thought was interesting, and even understands Tony's Tarbell pen name. Tony asks him about GGY, and turns out Finbar is well aware of them. He was certain the arcade high scores have been hacked, but after his friend in the tech department ran some diagnostics on the arcades, they all came back with no sign of a hack. Tony thinks GGY might be breaking into the Pizzaplex to play their arcades after hours. Finbar says they'd have to be using a security badge, but if those were lost or stolen, they'd be deactivated soon after, so GGY wouldn't be able to use it for long. As Tony leaves the arcade, he notices Glamrock Freddy watching him. He mistakes him for being friendly at first, but Freddy keeps his intense stare even after Tony waves at him. He then decides to go on the online forums to search for more information about GGY. A user named Morgan99 messages him, and after he reveals he's searching for GGY, they say they'll message Tony tomorrow night. In the meantime, he creates another plan against the Pizzaplex employee kiosk to see if they have any information about GGY. In the Pizzaplex's main lobby, Tony fakes an injury to distract an employee named Kathy. He swipes her keycard and uses it to get into an employee kiosk. Tony learns GGY has a Pizzaplex issue play pass, which he figures out has been modified to function more like a security badge, allowing them to get into any employee-only areas. There's also a list of people that GGY had brought to the Pizzaplex using his pass. Tony can only make out the name Mary, but quickly has to leave to avoid being discovered by a Pizzaplex employee. Tony thinks over what he's learned, piecing together that GGY is a very efficient hacker, who wanted to access behind-the-scenes areas of the Pizzaplex. As Tony is thinking, he once again spots Glamrock Freddy, now trailing him. He runs into the arcade and hides, evading Freddy. Later that night, Morgan99 finally responds to Tony, and he shares his findings with them. Morgan99 says he's playing with fire, and tells him to meet in 30 minutes under the south bleachers at the high school. Tony goes there, and it turns out that Morgan99 is Crystal, one of the girls from the arcade. She tells Tony that going after GGY isn't a great idea, evident by them having a hacked playpass, which Crystal seems to think is for something malicious. She believes that what GGY is doing is unpredictable and dangerous. She then reveals that she's also hacked the Pizzaplex, so I guess they just have the worst security system ever. Oh, that's why it's called Security Breach. Anyways, she was looking at the animatronics programming when she noticed some strange lines of code that didn't seem like they were part of the original program. These new lines of code create additional conversations and behaviors in Glamrock Freddy, Chica, Monty, and Roxy. Embedded in this code were seemingly random G's and Y's. Tony and Crystal both believe that GGY is responsible for the new additions to the code, and figure they're trying to control the animatronics in specific ways. Tony remembers how Freddy has been stalking him in the Pizzaplex, and Crystal reiterates that he needs to be careful. Tony goes back to writing his story about GGY for school, detailing what he's learned about the Pizzaplex's arcade and animatronic master. Tony gives his friends the completed story. Rab says he'll read it later, while Boots reads it while walking through the school's hallway. Rab and Boots say they'll work on the story that evening. Later, as Tony is doing some chores, he remembers watching a news report about Mary Schneider, the school's counselor who disappeared nearly 5 months ago. He thinks back to one of the people GGY's hacked playpass lent to the Pizzaplex was named Mary, and he thinks she might be the same Mary who is currently missing. Tony thinks maybe GGY goes to a school, knew Mary, and had a problem with her, so they brought her to the Pizzaplex to kill her. He breaks into the school after hours through a crack in the foundation and plans to access the school records through the librarian, Miss Hawkins' computer. He's one of her favorite students and has been at her office, and because of this, he knows her password. Tony accesses the computer and the counselor's list, where he learns that not only has Mary gone missing, but 2 of the 3 counselors hired after her have gone missing too. He realizes the other counselors were also listed on GGY's hacked playpass, and figures the counselors must have learned what GGY was up to, so they were lured to the Pizzaplex and killed. Tony hears something in the school and flees before he can figure anything else out. The next morning, Boots and Rab give Tony the revised story, which Rab has changed to have GGY as the most favored apprentice of a wizard, and the description of GGY's control over the animatronics has turned into an animatronic supervillain who went into battle with a tentacled monster. Tony is pretty upset with how his friends have ruined his story, taking all the realism out of it and turning it into something bizarre. Tony is forced to turn in the crappy story and drops Boots' pen name, referring to him by his real name, Ellis. To make matters worse, apparently Tony was caught on the cameras breaking into the school last night, despite the fact he avoided all of the cameras, leading him to believe that someone else was in the building with him last night and they ratted him out. As Tony is helping Mrs. Hawkins in the library as part of his detention, he runs into Rab, who apologizes for changing Tony's story. He sarcastically accepts Rab's apology and, just like Ellis, drops the pen name and refers to Rab by his real name, Greg. Yep, Rab/Dr. Rabbit's real name is Greg, aka Gregory, the main character in Security Breach and the true identity of GGY. Greg invites Tony to the Pizzaplex, saying he has some people he wants him to meet. The story ends with the implication that Tony accepts and is murdered by Gregory to cover his tracks. This story has so many implications. It strongly implies that Gregory was a follower of Glitchtrap, who was the main villain in Help Wanted, Security Breach, and Help Wanted 2. He's a malicious AI program connected to Phasma Entertainment's dark past. In Help Wanted, he manages to get into the mind of the beta tester Vanessa, making her a reluctant follower of him. It seems like a similar thing might have happened to Gregory. In this story, his nickname Dr. Rabbit and him taking over the Pizzaplex strongly implies he's under Glitchtrap's influence, since in the games, he's controlling the Pizzaplex. An Easter egg in Ruin also seems to confirm that Glitchtrap was the wizard in Gregory's story. You can find all sorts of wall graffiti in the abandoned Pizzaplex. Interestingly, one says wizard and has rabbit ears on it. Gregory was referred to as the wizard's favorite apprentice in his rewrite of Tony's story, which points to Glitchtrap being the one puppeting Gregory. The tentacled monster in Gregory's story could be referring to the Tangle, since notably, they have tentacles in Security Breach. Another thing to note, this story isn't exactly new information. We've previously heard a somewhat similar story in Security Breach's retro CDs, which are therapy sessions with the school counselors mentioned in the story. From those, we learn that Patient 46, a child, has hacked the Pizzaplex and installed new code in the animatronics. This story helps flesh it out and confirm that Patient 46 was Gregory, likely under Glitchtrap's control. A counselor also mentions that one of the previous therapists was found mangled, possibly by machinery. Gregory doesn't seem surprised by this, which hints that he did kill them, likely using the Pizzaplex animatronics. The final story we'll be discussing is the Monty Within, and while it doesn't focus on any important characters, it does give us some insight into AI possession, which is pretty important to understanding Glitchtrap and Vanessa. Once again, the story isn't very important and this video is already super long, so let's just cover the key points. The main character here is Kane, a high school student who's the star baseball hitter. For his thesis essay, he focuses on the left and right sides of the brain. Kane theorizes the left side of the brain is like a non-sentient computer. The right side is the sentient part. The left brain or computer part is like an inner AI that keeps us productive and our self-talk comes from it. Kane says it could cause some behavior issues from taking in bad data, which in this case would be like bad life experiences or advice, which would make it harmful for us and others. He ends his speech by saying the left side of the brain has a lot of control over what we say and do. Later, Kane and his little brother, Archer, go to the Mega Pizzaplex, where they hear about a groundbreaking new arcade game called Fazcade Tag Team, that allows you to be your own partner in a giant food fight between Phasma Entertainment characters. The arcade advertises that your favorite animatronic characters can sync with your mind, allowing you to control them with your thoughts and intentions. Kane sees this as a fun way to test out his theory with an AI animatronic partner. He chooses to play as Orville Elephant, a character he mentions is from Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator. It seems like Fazbear Entertainment also produced that game as part of their elaborate cover-up. Kinda funny that Kane is talking about Pizzeria Simulator, not knowing the pizza place is right under his feet. Archer chooses to play as Bonnie, and he's accompanied by Glamrock Chica, while Kane is joined by Monty. We learn that when Monty loses in games, he says,
"Oh, how could this happen? I'm so good looking."
Which is a neat nod to Fury's Rage, the fighting game Scott Cawthon created during one of Security Breach's delays. As Kane plays, he notices Monty is mimicking his moves, and when Kane stops moving, he does too, as if Monty is somehow connected to him. He notices a golden circle above him glowing irregularly, almost like brainwaves. Some people think this Monty AI is another form of the Mimic, but this story never really makes it clear. He's convinced the arcade is somehow using the left computer side of his brain, so to test out his theory, he returns to the arcade the next day. While he's there, he should really play Popgo's Arcade. He again notices how Monty freezes up when Kane is overanalyzing, and is in the flow when he is. He starts messing with the golden circle, which is a heavy plastic panel covering the source of the light. He tries to wiggle the panel off, and when that doesn't work, he hits it. Sparks shoot out and the entire game breaks, so Kane quickly flees the scene of the crime. After this, he gets intrusive thoughts that aren't his own, and he realizes the Monty AI from the arcade has infiltrated his brain. It seems like Monty is on the left side of Kane's brain, since he's now his inner voice. That leads to a lot of problems. He tells Kane's girlfriend to buy Zit Cream, tries to start a food fight, and eventually he takes full control of Kane's body. Monty is tired of Kane fighting against him, so he brings them into the school's woodworking shop and places Kane's body on a saw table. Kane is now a passenger in his own body, but is still able to feel as the saw cuts into his skull. This presumably kills Kane, and I assume Monty along with him. This story is very important for some of the newer installments, as it explains how AI's possessing humans works. As I previously discussed, Glitchtrap, one of the main villains in the newest games, corrupts Vanessa, the beta tester for the in-universe Freddy Fazbear Virtual Experience game. Now having influence over Vanessa, he begins to manipulate her into doing his bidding. By the time of Security Breach, she's become the security guard at the Pizzaplex and sometimes becomes Vanny. I believe that similar to Monty, Glitchtrap is in the left side of her brain, serving as her inner voice, explaining how he can manipulate her. Just like the Monty AI, he can sometimes take control of her body, which seems to transform her into Vanny. While those were all the main lore-heavy entries, some other stories do occasionally mention some important details. In the Bobby Dots Part 1, we learn about the daycare attendant's backstory. The son was originally an old stage animatronic, whose gimmick was to turn evil when the lights went out. When Fazbear Entertainment repurposed him for the Pizzaplex, they removed his performance functions, but the darkness trigger couldn't be removed. And the daycare's blackouts created the moon side of the daycare attendant. Fazbear Entertainment, being the cheapskates they are, decided fixing the sun was more trouble than it was worth, so they installed backup generators in the daycare play structures in case the lights ever went out. This origin story might be elaborated upon in Secret of the Mimic, since in the PAX demo, there was sun and moon imagery. In the story, Submechaphobia, which features an awesome Freddy's water park, it's revealed by a character named Daryl there are multiple pizzaplexes. This could be a throwaway line, but hey, we might see more pizzaplexes in the future, who knows? Similar to this, in the story Alone Together, we learn more about hauntings, and this may or may not be important, but I'll note it anyways. According to the story, there are 5 signs there's a ghost around you. 1. You start having strange dreams and flashes of memories that aren't yours, almost like the ghost possesses your thoughts when they're near. 2. You can feel chills or tingles on your arms or back when they're around. 3. There could be sudden movements of objects or sounds out of the blue. 4. If they attach themselves to you, you can sometimes hear the ghost's thoughts in your head like they're talking to you. The last and rarest sign is if you're really gifted, you can even see the ghost. These rules can be loosely applied to the rest of the series, but I'm wondering if they'll be important for A Secret of the Mimic and any future installments. Again, we'll just have to wait and see. Here's to hoping this is foreshadowing David appearing as a ghost. Those are all the tales from the Pizzaplex stories that we believe are important to the overarching Five Nights at Freddy's series, and we hope you've gained a clear understanding of the story. This was by far our biggest video on the channel. A lot of work went into this from all of us. So if you did enjoy this video, please consider liking, subscribing, and joining our monthly membership. It helps support us, and you get a bunch of cool perks like shoutouts in our videos, custom emojis, badges next to your name, exclusive looks at upcoming projects, and more. Thanks for watching, and check out some of our other videos.